There is a particular kind of loneliness that exists even when you're not alone. You're at a gathering. People are laughing, talking, touching each other's arms in that easy way that signals belonging. And you're there, present, participating even. But there's a glass wall between you and all of it. You can see through it, you can hear through it, but you can't touch the other side. And everyone else seems to not notice the wall at all. If you've spent significant portions of your life struggling to form or maintain friendships, you know this feeling intimately. Not the dramatic isolation of someone who has no one, but the quieter, more confusing isolation of someone who is around people constantly and still feels fundamentally alone. And you've probably spent years trying to figure out why, analyzing your social behavior, reading articles about how to make friends, wondering what everyone else learned that you didn't. Let's be honest about what we're actually discussing here, because the internet is full of content that takes the experience of social struggle and reframes it as evidence of superiority. You don't have friends because you're too deep, too authentic, too selective, too intelligent for the people around you. And while some of those framings contain grains of truth, they also serve a purpose that isn't entirely helpful. They let you avoid the harder, more uncomfortable examination of what's actually happening, because sometimes the reason you don't have friends is that you're too deep, and sometimes it's that you're too afraid, and sometimes it's that your social skills need development, and sometimes it's that you haven't put yourself in positions where friendship is possible, and often it's some complicated combination of all of these things simultaneously. And untangling that combination requires more honesty than most content in this space is willing to offer. Let's start with the neurology, because there's a real physiological dimension to why. Some people find social interaction harder than others, and understanding this dimension removes some of the shame while also refusing to use it as an excuse. Your nervous system has a particular sensitivity profile. How much stimulation it can process before becoming overwhelmed, how quickly it regulates after social interaction, how intensely it registers the emotional states of people around you. These are not character flaws. They're neurological configurations. Some people can walk into a room of strangers and feel energized. Their nervous system reads the environment as stimulating rather than threatening. Other people walk into the same room and feel their cortisol spike. Their system reads the same environment as demanding, overwhelming, potentially unsafe. If you're in the second category, social interaction genuinely costs you more energy than it costs others. It's not laziness. It's not antisocial behavior. It's a different baseline level of arousal that makes the same social situation require more resources to navigate. And this difference is real, measurable, and not something you can simply think your way past. But here's where honesty becomes important. Acknowledging this neurological reality doesn't mean you're off the hook for developing social skills and relationships. It means you might need to approach the project differently than someone with a less sensitive nervous system. You might need more recovery time between social events. You might need to start in lower stimulation environments. You might need to build friendships more gradually, with more space between interactions. The sensitivity is real, but it's a parameter to work within, not a wall you can't cross. Let's examine the fear dimension, because this is where most people get stuck and where the flattering narratives about depth and selectivity become most misleading. Fear of social rejection is one of the most powerful motivational forces in human psychology. It evolved that way, because for our ancestors, social exclusion was literally life-threatening. Being cast out of the group meant death, and that wiring hasn't fully updated for modern life, where social exclusion is painful but rarely fatal. For some people, this fear operates at a manageable level. They might feel nervous before meeting someone new, but they push through it. The discomfort doesn't override their desire for connection. For others, the fear is so intense that it becomes a genuine barrier. Every social interaction feels fraught with risk. Every possible rejection feels catastrophic. And the mind, trying to protect you from this perceived catastrophe, generates elaborate reasons why you don't actually need or want the social connection you're afraid to pursue. I'm too selective. People are too shallow for me. I prefer being alone. These statements might feel true, and they might even contain truth, but they also might be the mind's way of making peace with a fear it can't directly face, because it's much more comfortable to believe you're above the need for friendship than to admit you want it desperately and are terrified of pursuing it. This isn't a criticism, it's an observation about how fear operates. It disguises itself. It masquerades as preference or wisdom or independence. And as long as you accept its disguise without examination, the underlying fear remains unaddressed, which means the isolation continues. Not because you've consciously chosen it, because the fear has chosen it for you, and you've let it, because the alternative is too uncomfortable to face. Let's talk about what actually creates friendships, because most people have a surprisingly vague understanding of this, and that vagueness makes the whole project feel mysterious and uncontrollable when it's actually quite concrete. Friendships form through proximity, repeated interaction, and gradual disclosure. That's it. That's the formula. It's not complicated. But it requires conditions that many people's lives don't currently provide. Proximity means being physically near the same people regularly, not once or twice, regularly. The research on friendship formation consistently shows that repeated casual contact is one of the strongest predictors of developing close relationships. You don't need to have deep conversations every time. You just need to be there, consistently, in the same space. Repeated interaction means seeing the same people over time, not in one-off contexts, in ongoing ones. Classes, workplaces, clubs, neighborhoods, religious communities. Any context where you'll encounter the same faces week after week. Each encounter adds to a shared history, and shared history is the foundation of closeness. Gradual disclosure means slowly revealing more of yourself over time, starting with surface-level information and, as trust develops, moving toward more vulnerable truths. This process can't be rushed, it can't be forced, and for people who are afraid of vulnerability, it can feel impossibly slow. But it's the mechanism by which people become genuinely close. There's no shortcut. If your life currently lacks the conditions for these three things, no amount of depth or selectivity or authentic desire for connection will produce friendships. You literally can't form them in a vacuum. And examining whether your life is structured to support friendship formation is a much more productive exercise than examining whether your personality is too complex for other people. Let's address the social skills question directly, because it's the one most people avoid. Because admitting you might lack certain social skills feels like admitting something is wrong with you. But social skills are skills, not innate qualities. They're learned behaviors that can be developed with practice, and some people, for various reasons, didn't learn them in the environments where they were supposed to be learned. Maybe you grew up in a household where social interaction wasn't modeled well, where your parents didn't demonstrate how to navigate friendships, how to repair small conflicts, how to show interest in others without it being transactional. Maybe you were bullied or excluded in childhood, and the lesson you learned was that social interaction equals pain, which made you avoid practicing the very skills you needed. Or maybe you're on the autism spectrum or have ADHD, or another neurological difference that makes certain social conventions genuinely harder to read or execute. Not impossible, harder. And the gap between harder and impossible is where a lot of people get stuck, because they assume that if something is hard for them, it must be impossible, when in reality it just requires more deliberate attention than it does for others. The specific skills that matter most for forming friendships are surprisingly simple. Asking questions and actually listening to the answers. Remembering details about people's lives and following up on them. Showing up consistently, even when it's inconvenient. Being willing to initiate contact rather than waiting for others to do it. Tolerating the awkwardness of early-stage friendship, which is always at least a little awkward for everyone, even people who seem effortless at it. None of these are natural talents. They're practices. And if you haven't been practicing them, or if you've been deliberately avoiding them because they feel uncomfortable, you're not going to suddenly feel natural at them. They're going to feel forced and deliberate for a while. And that's okay. Most things feel forced before they feel natural. That's how learning works. Let's talk about the depth question, because this is where the conversation usually goes when people who struggle socially try to make sense of their experience. You want depth. You want meaningful connection. You want people who understand you at a level that most interactions never reach. And this desire for depth is real and valid and worth honoring. But it can also become a trap, because the insistence on depth can become a standard so high that no real relationship can meet it. Every potential friendship is measured against an ideal of profound mutual understanding that might not exist. And every real person, with their limitations and their ordinariness and their inability to perfectly mirror your inner world, falls short. Not because they're not worth knowing, because no one can be what your ideal demands. The most meaningful friendships most people have are not the perfect soul connection friendships the ideal promises. They're the imperfect, sometimes frustrating, occasionally disappointing but ultimately sustaining relationships that develop when two flawed people show up for each other over time. They're not built on instant understanding. They're built on repeated choice. The choice to keep showing up, keep investing, keep paying attention to another person despite the inevitable imperfections. If you've been waiting for friendship to feel like an instant recognition, a sense of finally being understood without having to explain yourself, you might be waiting for a long time. Not because that kind of recognition never happens, but because it almost never happens at the beginning. It develops, slowly, through the accumulation of shared experience and mutual investment. And if you're skipping the accumulation phase in search of the recognition, you're bypassing the very process that creates what you actually want. Here's something that rarely gets said in these conversations. Some of the difficulty you experience in forming friendships might be about what you bring to them, not just what you expect from them. And examining this honestly requires a level of self-awareness that's uncomfortable but necessary. People who struggle socially often describe themselves as loyal, deep, authentic. And they might be all of those things. But they might also be difficult in ways they don't fully see, difficult to reach, because they keep people at a distance while wanting closeness. Difficult to understand, because they don't express themselves clearly, assuming others should be able to sense what they mean. Difficult to be around, because their intensity or their criticism or their withdrawal creates an energy that pushes people away before genuine connection can form. None of this is about being a bad person. It's about patterns that developed for very good reasons and are now operating in contexts where they're counterproductive. The self-protection that served you in a hostile environment becomes a barrier in a safe one. The standards that kept you from being hurt become impossible to satisfy. The intensity that makes your connections feel profound also makes them feel overwhelming to other people who might otherwise be willing to show up. Examining these patterns honestly, not through the lens of what's wrong with me, but through the lens of what am I doing that might not be working, is some of the most valuable work you can do. Not because you need to change who you are, because some of how you are, specifically some of how you've learned to be, might be actively preventing what you most want. Let's talk about the role of vulnerability, because this is where most of the real work happens. Because forming friendships requires letting people see you, not the curated, controlled, carefully managed version, the actual you, the uncertain, sometimes struggling, not entirely sure what they're doing version. And for people who learned that being seen was dangerous, this requirement feels almost impossible. Vulnerability isn't a grand gesture. It's small. It's saying, I'm having a hard time instead of I'm fine. It's admitting you don't know something instead of pretending you do. It's letting someone see you make a mistake instead of covering it up. These small moments of honesty are what create the sense of being known, and they require trusting that the person receiving them won't use them against you. That trust doesn't come from nowhere. It's built through observation, through watching how someone handles the small things you've already shared. Do they treat it with care? Do they remember it? Do they use it to understand you better, or do they weaponize it? You're reading data constantly about whether this person is safe, and if the data is ambiguous, which it usually is in the early stages of any relationship, you can either wait for more data or take the small risk of offering a little more of yourself. The people who form friendships most successfully aren't the ones who trust blindly. They're the ones who take calculated risks, who offer small pieces of themselves and observe the response, who are willing to be slightly uncomfortable in the service of connection. This isn't recklessness. It's the necessary cost of any meaningful relationship. And if the cost feels too high, if any vulnerability at all feels like too much to risk, that's worth examining, not as a moral failing, but as information about how wounded the trust system still is. Let's address something else that contributes to the struggle and rarely gets named: the way modern life has structurally undermined the conditions that friendships need to form. Because this isn't entirely a personal problem, it's also a cultural one. Decades ago, people lived in more stable communities. They stayed in the same neighborhoods, worked at the same jobs, attended the same social institutions for years. These stable contexts provided the proximity and repeated interaction that friendships require. You didn't have to try to make friends, you just had to exist in the same space as other people long enough, and connection emerged naturally. But modern life is characterized by mobility, fragmentation, and isolation. People move frequently, work remotely, spend enormous amounts of time in digital rather than physical social spaces. The contexts that used to provide organic friendship formation have eroded, and in their absence, forming friendships requires much more deliberate effort than it used to, effort that many people don't know how to exert because they never needed to before. This doesn't excuse you from the work, but it contextualizes it. You're not failing at something that should be easy. You're attempting something that has become genuinely difficult in the current cultural moment. And the fact that it's difficult doesn't mean it's not worth doing. It just means it requires intention and strategy in ways it didn't for previous generations. So what does actually help? Not in theory, in practice. What are the concrete, unglamorous steps that create the conditions for friendship to develop? Put yourself in physical proximity to the same people regularly. Join something: a class, a club, a volunteer organization, a sports league, anything that gets you around the same faces on a weekly basis. Not once, consistently, for months. The initial interactions will probably feel awkward and superficial. That's normal. That's not failure. That's the beginning of the process. Initiate. Don't wait for other people to reach out. Text first. Suggest getting coffee. Ask if someone wants to grab lunch. The discomfort of initiating is real, but so is the isolation of waiting indefinitely for others to pursue you. Most people are also waiting. Someone has to go first. Be genuinely curious about other people, not as a technique, as an actual orientation. Ask questions and listen to the answers. Follow up next time. Notice what they care about. This isn't manipulation or social performance. It's the basic mechanism by which people feel seen and valued. Lower your standards for early interactions, not permanently, temporarily. Allow friendships to start shallow. Allow the early stages to be about logistics and surface topics and gentle humor, rather than immediately diving into meaningful conversation. The depth will come if both people invest in it over time. But it can't be the entry point for most friendships. Accept awkwardness as normal, rather than as evidence that something is wrong. The beginning of any friendship is at least somewhat awkward. People who seem effortlessly social have simply stopped noticing their own awkwardness. It's still there. They've just normalized it. You can normalize it too. It just takes practice. And be patient. Friendship formation research suggests it takes roughly 50 hours of interaction to move from acquaintance to casual friend, and over 200 hours to become close friends. That's not something that happens in a week or a month. It's months of consistent, low-key presence, and most people give up long before they've invested that much time. Here's the final thing that needs to be said. The loneliness you feel is valid. It deserves to be acknowledged without being immediately reframed as something positive or meaningful. Loneliness is painful. It's one of the most painful human experiences, and feeling it doesn't make you weak or broken. It makes you human. But loneliness also doesn't have to be permanent. It's not a fixed trait. It's a condition that responds to conditions. And if the conditions of your life aren't currently supporting connection, those conditions can change, not overnight, not without effort, not without the discomfort that comes with doing things differently than you've been doing them. You might not be too deep for other people. You might just be too afraid to let them see how deep you are. You might not be too authentic for the world. You might just not have given the world enough access to your authenticity to find the people who can handle it. You might not be too much. You might just not have found the right environment for your particular amount. These distinctions matter, because they shift the question from what's wrong with me that I can't have friends to what do I need to change about my life to create the conditions where friendship becomes possible. And that second question has answers. Concrete, actionable, genuinely useful answers. They're not glamorous. They're not particularly inspiring. They require patience and discomfort, and the willingness to look awkward for a while. But they work, not for everyone immediately, not perfectly, but consistently, over time, for people willing to do them. And you're willing, or you wouldn't be here, paying attention to this, wanting something different from what you currently have. You're not broken. You're not too much. You're not fundamentally incapable of connection. You're just someone who hasn't yet built the life that supports it. And building that life is possible. It starts with showing up, repeatedly, imperfectly, in spaces where other people are also showing up, and letting the slow, ordinary, unglamorous process of becoming someone's friend unfold at its own pace. It's not the dramatic story you might have imagined, but it's the real one, and real is better than imagined. It always has been.